They called him the Winter Duke. A man with frost in his veins who needed a wife for 1 year, nothing more, nothing less. Alice was meant to be a forgotten pawn, a disposable bride cast aside with a quiet settlement. Instead, she became the obsession that nearly burned his empire to the ground. London, 1884. The rain battered the soot-stained windows of a rapidly emptying townhouse in Bloomsbury. Alice Hensley sat in the centre of the drawing-room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as she watched men carry away her mother's rosewood piano. The death of her father, Lord Thomas Hensley, had brought not only grief but total financial ruin. Thomas had been a man of grand visions and terrible investments, leaving his 21-year-old daughter to face a mountain of debt. The most dangerous of these creditors was a ruthless financier named Reginald Garmond, a man who had made it abundantly clear that if Alice could not produce the £10,000 her father owed by month's end, she would be paying the debt in a far more unsavoury manner, in one of his illicit gentlemen's establishments. Alice had precisely 3 shillings to her name. It was in this moment of sheer desperation that a sleek black carriage, bearing a ducal crest, pulled up to her door. From it emerged Mr. Archibald Finch, a solicitor whose sharp eyes and stiff posture spoke of immense, unyielding wealth. He did not come with condolences. He came with a contract. My employer, Albert Pendleton, the Duke of Westmoreland, finds himself in a rather tedious predicament, Finch explained, refusing the tea Alice offered from a chipped porcelain cup. The late Duke's will stipulates that His Grace must marry before his 30th birthday, which is merely 3 weeks away, or forfeit the controlling shares of the Pendleton shipping fleet to his cousin. His Grace has no desire for romance, nor does he wish for a permanent fixture in his life. He requires a disposable bride, a woman of noble birth, albeit fallen circumstances, who will sign a legally binding agreement. Alice stared at the thick parchment Finch laid upon the table. And the terms a marriage of exactly 1 year. You will reside at his remote estate in Cornwall out of the public eye. You will not expect affection, companionship, or consummation. You will be a ghost in his halls. On the 366th day, the marriage will be quietly annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. In exchange, His Grace will immediately clear all your father's debts and provide you with a lifetime annuity of £2,000 a year. It was social suicide. A divorced or annulled woman in Victorian society was ruined. But looking at the empty walls where her family's portraits used to hang, and imagining the predatory smile of Reginald Garmond, Alice reached for the pen. "Where do I sign?" she asked, her voice steady. She met Albert Pendleton on their wedding day. The ceremony took place in a bleak, dimly lit chapel, in the presence of only a bishop and Mr. Finch. The Duke of Westmoreland was a towering, imposing figure. He possessed the kind of aristocratic beauty that looked carved from marble, cold, flawless, and entirely unforgiving. His eyes, a striking shade of pale grey, barely registered her existence as they exchanged their vows. "You understand your place," Miss Hensley Albert murmured, as he slid a heavy cold diamond ring onto her finger. It was a statement, not a question. "Perfectly, Your Grace." Alice replied, her chin tilted upward, despite the chill radiating from him. "Good. See that you remain invisible." Within hours, Alice was packed into a carriage bound for Oakhaven Manor, a sprawling Gothic fortress perched on the jagged cliffs of the Cornish coast. Albert rode on horseback the entire journey, preferring the biting wind to sharing a carriage with his new wife. Upon arriving at Oakhaven, the reality of her isolation set in. The servants were sparse and deeply intimidated by their master. The manor was vast, echoing, and terribly lonely. For the first 2 months, Albert kept to his end of the bargain. He was a phantom. They dined at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany table in suffocating silence. If they passed in the corridors, he offered nothing more than a curt nod. Alice was exactly what he paid for a convenient piece of paperwork. But Alice was not a woman built for idleness. Raised by a father who treated her more like an eager pupil than a decorative daughter, she possessed a sharp mind for figures and organization. Bored by her endless confinement, she began requesting the household ledgers from the terrified estate manager. She found massive discrepancies, years of neglect, and servants stealing the Duke blind. Quietly, methodically, she began to fix it. She dismissed the corrupt staff, renegotiated with local merchants, and brought warmth back to the drafty halls. She expected no praise, she simply needed a purpose. She did not realize the Duke was watching. The shift began in the dead of winter. A brutal storm had cut Oakhaven off from the rest of the world, trapping Albert indoors. Forced out of his study by a smoking chimney, he retreated to the main library, only to find Alice already there, fast asleep in a leather armchair, with a heavy ledger resting on her chest. Albert approached her silently. He had spent the last 3 months actively ignoring her features. Now illuminated by the firelight, he noticed the dark lashes resting against her pale cheeks, the stubborn set of her jaw even in sleep, and the ink stains on her fingers. He gently pulled the ledger from her grasp, intending to set it aside. Instead, his eyes fell on her meticulous handwriting. In weeks, she had corrected years of financial bleeding that his own stewards had missed. He looked down at his disposable bride, feeling an unfamiliar, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. She stirred her eyes, fluttering open. When she saw him towering over her, she didn't flinch. She simply sat up and smoothed her skirts. "My apologies, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude on your sanctuary. This is my ledger," Albert said, his voice a low rumble. "Why are you managing my estate?" "Because someone had to," Alice replied evenly, standing to meet his gaze. "Your staff was robbing you. I assumed a man of your business acumen would prefer not to be made a fool of." For the first time since they met, Albert Pendleton smiled. It was a terrifying feral thing. You have a sharp tongue for a woman who was purchased to be invisible. I was purchased to be your wife for a year. The contract forbade consummation. It said nothing about auditing your books. The tension crackled between them, thick and electric. Albert stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her. He reached out a gloved finger, tracing the line of her jaw. Alice held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Careful, Alice," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave. "I am not used to things in my house fighting back." The fragile equilibrium of their arrangement shattered completely the following week with the unannounced arrival of Lord Henry Fitzroy Albert's ambitious cousin and Lady Beatrice Croft. Beatrice was a stunning, venomous widow who had long believed she would be the Duchess of Westmoreland. She was furious to find her prize snatched away by a nobody. Henry and Beatrice brought the toxic politics of London straight into the quiet halls of Oakhaven. At dinner that evening, Beatrice launched a thinly veiled assault. "It is so fascinating, Alice, how quickly your fortunes changed," Beatrice purred, swirling her wine. "One day your father is weeping in the streets over his debts, and the next you are wearing the Westmoreland diamonds. It's almost like a business transaction. Tell me, do you charge by the hour, or was it a lump sum?" The dining room fell into a dead silence. Albert's hand tightened around his silver fork, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to tear Beatrice apart, but Alice spoke first. "It was a lump sum." Lady Beatrice Alice said, her voice dripping with sweet, icy grace. "A sum large enough to secure a duke rather than a mere widow's pension. Though I imagine you wouldn't know much about securing anything permanent, given how quickly your late husband sought the grave to escape your company." Henry choked on his wine. Beatrice went rigid, her face flushing crimson. Albert stared at Alice, utterly mesmerized. The cold mechanical organ in his chest skipped a beat. She was magnificent. She was fire and steel, and in that moment, the idea of letting her walk away at the end of the year became a physical impossibility. Later that night, Alice was in the library trying to calm her racing heart when the double doors locked shut with a heavy click. She spun around to find Albert leaning against the wood, shedding his dinner jacket. His eyes were dark, predatory, and entirely focused on her. "Your Grace?" she asked, taking a step back. "Albert," he commanded, stalking toward her. "You shouldn't be here." The guests, "Henry is here to spy Albert," interrupted, closing the distance until she was backed against a bookshelf. "He suspects the marriage is a sham. He is looking for proof of non-consummation to invalidate the will and steal the shipping fleet. Beatrice is helping him." Alice gasped. "Then we must be careful. We must keep up appearances." "Yes," Albert murmured, lifting his hand to tangle his fingers in the hair at the nape of her neck. "We must be very, very convincing. Albert, the contract." "To hell with the contract." His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a conquest. It was years of rigid control snapping in an instant. Alice meant to push him away, to remind him of the rules, but the moment his lips parted, hers, a dormant, desperate heat, flared to life within her. She kissed him back, her hands gripping the fine silk of his waistcoat, pulling him closer. Albert groaned, hauling her flush against his body. He devoured her, tasting the sweet, intoxicating poison that would become his undoing. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. Albert looked down at her swollen lips and flushed cheeks. A terrifying, obsessive realization settled over him. He had taken a taste of something he could never, ever give up. "You will move your things into my chambers tonight," Albert ordered, his voice ragged but absolute. "To fool your cousin Alice," whispered, still dazed. Albert's eyes darkened as his thumb traced her lower lip. He knew the truth, even if she didn't yet. Henry's plot was the perfect excuse. He was going to use his cousin's treachery to lock his disposable bride in a cage of his own making, and he would destroy anyone who tried to take her from him. Yes, Albert lied smoothly. To fool my cousin. Moving into the Duke's sprawling master suite was supposed to be a theatrical performance. That was the lie Alice told herself, as the servants hauled her modest trunks into Albert's cavernous velvet-draped chambers. But the moment the heavy oak doors sealed them inside, the charade melted into a feverish reality. That first night, Albert did not touch her with the rough urgency of a man proving a point. Instead, he undressed her with a reverence that terrified her more than his coldness ever had. The consummation of their sham marriage was not a transaction. It was a surrender. By the time the morning sun pierced the heavy fog of the Cornish coast, the ink on Mr. Finch's airtight contract had been metaphorically washed away. Over the next few months, Oakhaven Manor transformed. The Winter Duke, infamous for his impenetrable detachment, became a man entirely consumed by his wife. It was a dark, suffocating brand of devotion. If Alice spent too long walking the cliffside paths, Albert would abandon meetings with his shipping captains to track her down, his imposing silhouette cutting through the mist until he had her safely tucked against his side. He draped her in scandalous amounts of wealth, ropes of South Sea pearls emeralds, sourced from private dealers in Amsterdam, and silk gowns imported from Paris. Alice was no longer a disposable ghost. She was the absolute center of a ruthless man's universe. But outside the impenetrable walls of Albert's obsession, the venom of Lord Henry Fitzroy and Lady Beatrice Croft continued to fester. Henry's window to contest the inheritance was rapidly closing. The one-year deadline stipulated by the late Duke's will was only weeks away. If Albert remained happily married by his 30th birthday, the Pendleton shipping fleet and its millions in revenue would forever remain out of Henry's grasp. Beatrice, fueled by wounded pride and vicious jealousy, took matters into her own hands. She employed private investigators in London to dig through the ashes of the Hensley family's ruin. It did not take long for them to unearth the rotting carcass of Lord Thomas Hensley's debts. Nor did it take long to find Reginald Garmond. Garmond was a shark who thrived in the murky waters of London's illicit gambling and extortion rings. When Beatrice sent a carriage for him, armed with the promise of destroying the Duke of Westmoreland, Garmond eagerly answered the call. The storm broke on a Tuesday evening. Albert had travelled to the nearby port of Falmouth to inspect a newly docked merchant vessel, leaving Alice alone at Oakhaven for the first time in months. She was in the estate's glass conservatory, pruning a rare orchid Albert had gifted her, when the heavy glass doors swung open. It was not a servant. "Well, well, you've certainly moved up in the world, Miss Hensley," a greasy, familiar voice sneered. Alice froze, the pruning shears slipping from her gloved hands. Reginald Garmond stood in the damp, floral-scented air, wearing a tailored suit that could not hide his predatory slouch. Beside him stood Lord Henry, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across his aristocratic face. "Mr. Garmond," Alice breathed, her blood running cold. "How did you get in here?" "I invited him," Henry said smoothly, stepping forward. "Mr. Garmond has brought some fascinating documents to my attention. Promissory notes signed by your late father, offering his daughter's services in exchange for debt forgiveness. Documents that predate your marriage to my cousin." Garmond stepped closer, his eyes raking over Alice's velvet gown. "The debt was never formally cleared, Duchess. Technically, your father sold you to me before the Duke ever bought you. If these papers were to find their way to the London presses, the scandal would invalidate this little sham of a marriage instantly. A duke cannot be legally wed to a woman whose primary contract belongs to a brothel." Alice's heart hammered against her ribs, but the months spent matching wits with Albert Pendleton had forged iron in her spine. She lifted her chin, meeting Garmond's filthy gaze. "My husband cleared my father's debts through a solicitor, but the original collateral agreement remained in my vault." Garmond smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "Unless, of course, you are willing to come with me quietly. Spare the Duke the humiliation of a public annulment." "She will do no such thing," a voice rumbled from the shadows of the conservatory entrance. The temperature in the room plummeted. Albert stood in the doorway, his riding coat soaked with rain, his pale grey eyes blazing with a violence so pure it made Henry physically recoil. He had ridden his horse to the point of exhaustion to return early, driven by an unexplainable paranoid need to be near his wife. "Albert." Henry stammered, his smugness evaporating into sheer panic. "I was merely—" "Shut your mouth, Henry, before I cut out your tongue." Albert said, his voice a lethal whisper. He stalked into the room, his gaze locked entirely on Garmond. Garmond puffed out his chest, attempting to bravado his way through the encounter. "Your Grace, I hold the legal rights to—" Albert didn't let him finish. In one blindingly fast motion, the Duke of Westmoreland closed the distance, his gloved hand shooting out to wrap around Garmond's throat. Garmond choked his feet, lifting off the terracotta floor as Albert slammed him backward into a wrought iron trellis. Pots shattered, scattering dirt and ruined blossoms. "Albert, stop!" Alice cried out, but she did not move to intervene. "You dare walk into my home!" Albert snarled, his grip tightening as Garmond's face turned a mottled purple. "You dare speak to my wife! You dare breathe the same air as her!" The papers," Garmond wheezed, clawing uselessly at Albert's steel grip. Albert leaned in close. I own half the magistrates in London, Garmond. By tomorrow morning, your accounts at Baring's Bank will be seized. Your establishments will be raided by Scotland Yard under the command of Inspector Davies. And if you ever so much as think my wife's name again, I will have you chained to the anchor of one of my galleons and dropped into the Atlantic." Albert tossed the man to the floor like a piece of discarded garbage. Garmond scrambled backward, coughing violently, terrified out of his mind. Albert turned his terrifying gaze to his cousin. Henry was trembling, pressed flat against the glass wall of the conservatory. "Pack your bags, Henry," Albert commanded. "You and Beatrice have 1 hour to leave my property. If you ever set foot in Cornwall again, I will ensure you do not leave it alive." As Henry and Garmond fled the room like beaten dogs, Albert stood breathing heavily amidst the ruined flowers. Alice slowly approached him, placing a gentle hand on his tense, rigid arm. The monster retreated, and the man returned. Albert pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Are you harmed?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her shoulders, her face. "I am fine, Albert," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You protected me." "Always," he vowed against her skin. "I will burn the world down before I let anyone take you from me." Despite the dramatic expulsion of Henry and Beatrice, a dark, silent shadow loomed over Alice as the weeks bled into late autumn. The date on Mr. Finch's contract was approaching. The 366th day. Albert had destroyed Garmond, humiliated his cousin, and secured his inheritance. He had won. But he had never actually spoken the words of love. He was wildly possessive, violently protective, and undeniably obsessed. But Alice's insecurities whispered that she was merely a prize he refused to let others touch. To a man like Albert, keeping what was his was second nature. But did he want her as a wife or as a conquered territory? On the morning of the 366th day, Alice awoke in the massive four-poster bed to find Albert's side, cold and empty. A terrible hollow ache settled in her chest. She assumed he had left early for the docks to avoid the awkwardness of their parting. Determined to leave with her dignity intact, Alice summoned Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, to help pack her original battered trunks. She left the Parisian silks and the Westmoreland diamonds in the armoires. She dressed in the simple, modest wool gown she had worn the day she arrived at Oakhaven. She walked down the grand, sweeping staircase, expecting to find Mr. Finch waiting with the annulment papers and her promised annuity. Instead, the grand foyer was entirely empty. Confused, Alice made her way to Albert's private study. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open to find Albert standing by the roaring fireplace. He was not dressed in his usual immaculate suits. He wore only a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up his hair, slightly disheveled. He was staring down at a piece of thick parchment in his hands. "I am ready to sign the annulment papers so you may be free of me." Albert stared at her, utterly, perfectly still. The silence in the study grew so thick it was suffocating. Slowly, methodically, Albert walked toward her. With every step, the predator in him seemed to awaken. "Free of you," he repeated, his voice low, vibrating with a dangerous intensity. "Yes," Alice whispered, stepping back until her spine hit the heavy oak door. "I packed only what I brought with me. I left the jewels. I left the dresses." Albert stopped mere inches from her. He reached out his large hands, gripping her shoulders with a desperation he could no longer hide. "You think I want to be free of you? You think I went to war with my own blood, destroyed men, and tore my own life apart, just to let you walk out that door?" Alice looked up into his eyes and saw the raw, unrestrained panic bleeding through his usual cold facade. "The contract," she started. "Damn the contract," Albert snarled. He turned on his heel, strode back to the roaring fireplace, and threw the thick parchment straight into the flames. Alice gasped as the ink curled and the paper blackened, turning to ash in seconds. The legal document that had dictated her fate, that had saved her from ruin, was gone. "Albert, what have you done?" "Your proof of the agreement." "I don't need proof of an agreement, because there is no agreement anymore," Albert said, turning back to her. The frost was entirely gone from his veins, replaced by a raging, unquenchable fire. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling her flush against his chest, his hands tangling in her hair. "There is no annulment, Alice. There is no quiet settlement. You are not a ghost, and you are certainly not disposable." He crashed his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "You are my wife. Before God, before the law, and before me. I am entirely, helplessly obsessed with you. I cannot sleep unless you are breathing beside me. I cannot focus on my ships, my ledgers, or my empire, because my mind is constantly consumed by where you are and who is looking at you." Tears pricked Alice's eyes, a profound, overwhelming relief crashing through her. "You never said," she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his linen shirt. "You never told me you loved me. I am a man who has lived his entire life in the freezing dark." Albert confessed, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell the sun that I needed it to survive. But I do, Alice. I love you. Brutally. Completely. If you try to leave this house, I will barricade the doors. If you try to run, I will chase you to the ends of the earth." Alice looked at the ashes of the contract settling in the hearth, and then up at the formidable, terrifying, deeply vulnerable man holding her. The Winter Duke had melted, and in his place was a husband who would tear the world apart to keep her safe. She reached up, cupping his face, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone. "Then it is a good thing I have absolutely no intention of running." Albert let out a ragged breath, capturing her lips in a kiss that was 1,000 times more passionate than their first. It was a promise sealed not in ink, but in the fierce, unbreakable bond of a love that defied every odd. Alice Hensley was brought to Oakhaven as a disposable pawn, but she would reign for the rest of her life as the irreplaceable queen of the Winter Duke's heart. Are you entirely obsessed with this intense historical romance? If Alice and Albert's fiery dramatic journey captured your heart, make sure to hit that like button and share this story with your fellow romance lovers. The drama, the betrayal, and the ultimate twist of passion. What was your favorite moment? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling, swoon-worthy story. Thank you for listening.